On the day of my mother's funeral, as I stood trembling in a black dress far too heavy for my young shoulders, my father pulled me into an empty room. His breath was cold, his voice a whisper I will never forget. Now you will be my wife too. At 16 years old, I lost not only my mother but also the safety of my home. Before I begin my story, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. I just want to know I'm not alone in this. And if you feel moved by what you hear, consider subscribing. It helps more people become aware of the reality of elder abuse. Now let me tell you what really happened. The church bells echoed that morning, slow and heavy, each strike reminding me of what I had lost. My mother, Elizabeth Williams, had been the light of our home, gentle, warm, and endlessly patient. She taught me how to braid my hair, how to cook simple meals, and most importantly, how to carry kindness in my heart even when the world was unkind. But that day, the world felt cruel beyond measure. I watched as they lowered her coffin into the ground, my heart pounding with a grief I didn't know how to carry. Relatives whispered their condolences, friends hugged me tightly, but nothing could fill the emptiness inside me. My father, Richard, stood tall beside me, his face unreadable. People praised his strength, telling me, "Your father is so strong for you, Sarah. You're lucky to have him." I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe that even though my mother was gone, my father would protect me. But as the last of the mourners left, my father's hand gripped my shoulder tightly. Without a word, he led me into the church's side room, the one no one used, where the candles burned low. The air was still, suffocating. It was there, surrounded by silence, that he leaned close to me and whispered those words that shattered my soul. "Now you will be my wife too." I froze. I thought I had misheard. My tears had barely dried from losing my mother, and yet in that moment, I lost the last piece of safety I had left. The days after my mother's funeral blurred together, each one soaked in grief and confusion. I remember sitting in my bedroom, staring at the framed photograph of her on my dresser. She was smiling in that picture, her arms wrapped around me during a picnic, her hair catching the sunlight. I kept asking myself, why did she have to leave me now? My father moved through the house like a shadow. To everyone else, he was the grieving widower, strong, quiet, noble. Neighbors brought casseroles and pies, patting him on the back, saying, "You're holding up so well." They never saw the look he gave me when no one was watching. That cold, unspoken reminder of the words he had whispered in the church. I avoided being alone with him, but that wasn't always possible. At night, the creak of the hallway floorboards made my stomach twist. His footsteps. Sometimes he would pause outside my door, and I would hold my breath until he walked away. Other times he would open the door just to say goodnight, his voice low, his eyes watching me too long. It was as if my room was no longer mine. Inside me there was a war. I wanted to scream, to tell someone, anyone, about what he had said. But every time I tried to open my mouth, my throat locked. What if no one believed me? What if they thought grief was making me imagine things? After all, my father was respected, even admired. And I was just a 16-year-old girl, fragile, emotional, broken by loss. The worst part was the loneliness. My mother had always been my shield. When I had a bad day at school, she would listen. When I felt nervous, she would hold me. Now there was no one to run to, no safe place to hide. One night, as I lay awake, I whispered into the dark, "Mom, what should I do?" I almost imagined her voice answering, "Stay strong, Sarah, and never let anyone break you." Her words, her presence, felt faint, but they were all I had. Still, the silence weighed heavy. The longer I kept my father's secret, the more it ate at me. I carried it to school, where my friends laughed about homework and dances, unaware that my world was collapsing. I carried it to church on Sundays, where people praised my father's devotion, while I felt like screaming from the pews. I was trapped. Not by chains or locks, but by fear. By silence. And I began to wonder, if I didn't find the courage soon, would this silence destroy me completely? The house felt colder without my mother, not just because her laughter was gone, but because every corner seemed filled with my father's watchful presence. At first, he didn't repeat the words he had whispered at the funeral. Instead, he wrapped his control in small, unsettling gestures. He would take my hand too long when passing me a dish at the table. He would stand too close when we spoke, his breath brushing my cheek. He started calling me, "my little lady of the house," as if I had been promoted into a role I never wanted. When relatives visited in the early weeks after the funeral, he put on a mask of grief and charm. "Sarah is such a comfort to me," he would say, patting my shoulder with fatherly pride. But behind closed doors, his gaze hardened, and I felt more like a prisoner than a daughter. The isolation came slowly, almost cleverly. One afternoon I asked if I could spend the night at my friend Rachel's house. He refused, saying, "People will talk if you leave me alone so soon after your mother's passing. They'll think you don't care." His words dripped with guilt, and I swallowed them in silence. School was the only place where I felt somewhat free, yet even there I carried his shadow. My grades began to slip. Teachers noticed my distraction, but I only shook my head when they asked if something was wrong. What could I say? That the man everyone admired, my father, had turned my home into a cage. At night, I often dreamed of my mother. In one dream, she stood at the edge of a field, reaching her hand toward me. I tried to run to her, but my father stood between us, blocking the way. When I woke, my chest would ache with the weight of helplessness. One evening after dinner, my father lingered at the table. He placed his hand on mine, his eyes narrowing. "Sarah," he said softly, "you must understand, your mother is gone. And now it's just you and me." My heart hammered in my chest. I pulled my hand back quickly, muttering something about homework. I rushed upstairs, shutting my door before he could follow. My hands trembled as I pressed my back against the wood. It was then I realized this wasn't going to fade. He wasn't going to stop. If I didn't find a way to escape his grip, the shadows in our house would consume me. Weeks turned into months, and the house grew heavier with silence. My father's control tightened, subtle but unrelenting. Every decision I made seemed to require his approval. What I wore, where I went, who I spoke to the outside world, nothing seemed unusual. People still admired him for raising a daughter alone. They spoke of his strength, his devotion, but I knew the truth. Behind closed doors I felt the walls closing in. One evening, I sat on the edge of my bed, clutching a small locket my mother had given me. Inside was her picture, her eyes gentle and kind. I whispered, "Mom, I can't do this anymore. I'm so scared." Tears slid down my cheeks, soaking my pillow. That night, I dreamed of her again, standing in the same field, her hand outstretched. But this time, she spoke. Her voice was soft yet steady. "Sarah, tell someone. You don't have to carry this alone." When I woke, my decision was clear, though it terrified me. I needed help. The very next Sunday, my father insisted we attend church as usual. After the service, relatives gathered in small groups, sharing stories and laughter. That's when I saw her, Aunt Margaret, my mother's older sister. Her presence felt like a lifeline. She had always been gentle with me, always listening without judgment. I walked up to her slowly, my hands trembling. "Aunt Margaret," I whispered, Can I talk to you, alone?" She studied my face for a long moment before nodding. We stepped outside, away from the crowd, standing beneath the old oak tree beside the church. The autumn leaves rustled above us, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The words spilled out in broken pieces. I told her about the funeral, about the whisper in the church, about the way my father watched me, touched me, controlled me. My voice shook, and I couldn't meet her eyes. When I finally looked up, tears streamed down her cheeks. She pulled me into her arms, holding me the way my mother once did. "Oh, Sarah," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You should never have had to carry this alone." For the first time since my mother's death, I felt seen. I felt believed. She promised me then and there that she would help me, that she would not let my father's shadow consume me. Her words lit a spark inside me, a fragile, trembling spark, but enough to remind me that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. That night as I lay in bed, I still heard my father's footsteps in the hallway. But for the first time, I wasn't entirely afraid, because now I had someone standing with me, someone who knew the truth. And that changed everything. After that day beneath the oak tree, Aunt Margaret became my secret anchor. She called often, always under the excuse of checking in. When she visited, she carried herself as though nothing was wrong, but her eyes always searched mine, silently asking, "Are you okay?" For the first time in months, I felt less alone. She began slipping me small notes of encouragement, folded into my school books or slipped into my hand when my father wasn't looking. Words like, "Stay strong. I believe you." They were lifelines I clung to. But my father noticed the change in me. He noticed everything. One evening after Margaret dropped me home, his eyes narrowed. "You've been spending a lot of time with your aunt lately," he said, his voice low. "What are you two whispering about?" My heart pounded, but I forced a weak smile. "She just misses Mom, that's all." He studied me, his gaze sharp as a knife. For a long moment I thought he knew. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, though his tone carried a warning. "Remember, Sarah, family business stays inside these walls. Outsiders don't need to know our struggles." Those words chilled me. Outsiders. To him, even my aunt, my mother's own sister, was the enemy. Aunt Margaret, however, wasn't easily fooled. She began making quiet plans. She told me in hushed whispers that she was speaking with a counselor, seeking advice on how best to help me. "We have to be careful," she warned. "If Richard suspects too much, he'll try to tighten his grip. But trust me, Sarah. I won't let him destroy you." Her words gave me hope. But they also sparked a new kind of fear. What if he did find out? What if he turned his anger not just on me, but on her too? One night I overheard him on the phone. His voice was sharp, angry. "She's mine to look after. No one else needs to interfere." My stomach dropped as I realized he was talking about me. The next day Margaret visited again, bringing groceries. She smiled politely at my father, but I noticed the stiffness in his jaw, the way he barely spoke to her. When she hugged me goodbye, she whispered, "Be ready, Sarah. Things may get difficult before they get better." Her words lingered in my mind that night as I lay awake, listening to the creak of the hallway floorboards. My father's footsteps stopped outside my door. For a long, breathless moment, the handle turned slightly, then stopped. The silence that followed was louder than any noise. I knew then that the battle had begun. And I also knew, if I wasn't careful, it could break me. The storm broke on an ordinary afternoon. It wasn't dramatic at first, just the slam of a door, the sharpness in my father's voice, and the realization that my secret was no longer safe. I had just come home from school when I heard him in the kitchen. His tone was cold, controlled, but his words made my stomach twist. "You've been talking to your aunt. Don't lie to me, Sarah." "I know." My breath caught. I clutched my school bag tighter. "Well, we just talk about Mom," I stammered. He stepped closer, his shadow towering over me. "Don't play games. You've been filling her head with nonsense. Do you think anyone will believe you over me? I'm your father. I provide for you. Without me, you'd have nothing." His words sliced through me, but before I could answer, there was a knock at the door. Sharp, firm, it was Aunt Margaret. Richard's face hardened. "Stay quiet," he hissed, but my heart was pounding too loud to obey. Margaret stepped inside, her presence calm but unshakable. "Richard," she said evenly, "I'm here for Sarah." The air in the room shifted. My father's eyes darkened, his control slipping. "She's my daughter," he snapped. "This is my house. You don't get to interfere." But Aunt Margaret didn't flinch. She stepped closer, placing a steady hand on my shoulder. "And Elizabeth was my sister. I won't stand by while her child suffers." I felt my father's rage boiling, his hands clenching at his sides. For a terrifying moment, I thought he might strike her. But Margaret's gaze never wavered. Her calmness was her strength, and it shielded me. "You may have fooled the neighbors," she said quietly, "but you won't fool me. Sarah has told me everything. And if you try to stop me from protecting her, I will go to the police, the church, anyone who will listen." The room fell silent. My father's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. His mask of power was cracking. For the first time, I looked him in the eye without trembling. My voice shook, but I spoke. "I'm not your wife. I'm your daughter, and I will never be what you want me to be." The words hung heavy in the air. My chest burned with fear, but also with relief. I had spoken. I had broken the silence. Richard's face twisted with anger. But Margaret pulled me closer, her arm like a shield. "It's over, Richard," she said firmly. "You will not hurt her again." That night I didn't sleep in that house. Margaret took me with her, her hand never letting go of mine. For the first time since my mother's death, I felt a breath of freedom. But I also knew this was only the beginning. Escaping the house was one thing. Escaping the scars my father left behind, that would take a lifetime. Living with Aunt Margaret felt like stepping into the sunlight after years of shadows. Her home was quiet, but not heavy. Safe, but not suffocating. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe without fear. She made me tea in the evenings, just as my mother once did. She never pushed me to talk, but when I was ready, she listened. Sometimes I cried through the words, other times I sat in silence, but she always reminded me, "You are not alone anymore, Sarah." The days slowly turned into weeks. My father tried to call to demand I come back, but Margaret shielded me. "She's not your possession, Richard," I heard her say once over the phone, her voice steady as steel. "And she never will be." He had lost control, and though the fear lingered in me, I began to see that his power had only ever lived in my silence. School became a place of healing too. I started focusing on my studies again, though some days were harder than others. Rachel, my best friend, eventually learned pieces of what I had been through. She didn't ask for details. She just sat with me at lunch, offering her presence like a quiet promise that life could be normal again. But the greatest strength came from remembering my mother. Her locket never left my neck. On the hardest nights I would open it, trace her picture with my fingers, and hear her voice in my heart, "Stay strong, Sarah. Never let anyone break you." It wasn't easy. Healing never is. Some nights I woke from nightmares sweating, convinced I heard footsteps outside my door. But slowly the shadows faded. I learned to replace fear with something stronger, resilience. And then, one day, I made a decision. I would tell my story, not to shame myself, not to relive the pain, but to show others that silence can be broken. When I first shared my truth, with Margaret by my side holding my hand, I felt the weight lift. Yes, people were shocked. Some turned away, unwilling to believe, but others leaned in, their eyes soft with compassion. Some whispered, "Me too." That's when I realized my voice was not just for me. It was for anyone who had ever been trapped in silence, afraid of not being believed. My words became both my healing and my weapon against the darkness. Today I live not as a victim but as a survivor. My father no longer controls my life. His shadow may linger in memory, but it does not define me. What defines me is the strength I inherited from my mother, the love I received from my aunt, and the courage I found within myself. If you are listening to this and carrying a secret of your own, hear me now, you are not alone. Your silence does not have to last forever. And your voice, your truth, is stronger than you think. Because on the day my mother was buried, I thought my life had ended too. But I was wrong. That day was not my ending. It was the beginning of my fight to live again. If this story touched your heart, remember, silence never heals, but sharing does. Many people live in shadows, carrying secrets they never chose. By speaking out, we bring light to the darkness. If you've ever felt silenced or betrayed, let this be your reminder you are not alone and your story matters. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to hear more real stories like this, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video. Together we give a voice to the voiceless.